In the center of the floor, taking up most of the available space, stands the handloom. It is a large wooden frame built of oak and beech, its beams darkened by time and the touch of hands. The warp threads stretch horizontally from the back beam, passing through heddles and reed, and they hang still at this early hour, motionless as drawn lines in the dimness. There are hundreds of these threads, each one fine as a hair, and together they form a subtle, shimmering plane that catches the grey light in a way that makes it seem almost metallic if you look at it from a certain angle. The loom is at rest. The treadles, two narrow wooden pedals worn smooth in the middle, sit level with the floor, waiting. The shuttle rests in a little wooden box at the side, a shaped piece of boxwood that fits perfectly in a man's palm. The weaver is there, standing near the window with a cup of tea in his hands. The cup, a simple earthenware vessel without decoration. Steam rises from the surface of the tea, curling into the cool air and disappearing. He has not yet begun to work. He simply stands in the pearl-colored light, listening to the house as it wakes. Below, in the rooms that face the street, someone moves a chair. The sound a soft scrape that travels through the floorboards and up into the attic, already muffled by distance and the dense old timber of the building. A door closes somewhere nearby, not with a slam, but with a firm wooden thud that speaks of a latch falling into place. These are familiar sounds, as much a part of the morning as the light itself. Outside the window, Spitalfields is stirring. The street is still wet from the rain that fell in the night, the cobbles dark and reflecting the pale sky in their uneven surfaces. A cart passes, its iron-rimmed wheels making a low rumble that you feel as much as you hear. A vibration that comes up through the brick walls and the joists. The driver does not call out. The horse walks with a slow, steady rhythm. Hoof beats a soft clop that fades towards the market. A sparrow lands on the gutter just beyond the window glass, its tiny claws scratching the lead, and it tilts its head once before flying off again. The weaver watches none of this directly, but stands in a kind of quiet attention, letting the world outside become a gentle backdrop, a presence that asks nothing of him. The attic itself is a place of simple order. The floorboards, though old and bearing the marks of countless footsteps, are clean, swept free of dust and stray fibers. In one corner, a small iron stove stands unlit, for the morning is not cold enough to need a fire, but a basket of kindling and a scuttle of coal sit ready beside it. A wooden chair with a rush seat is placed near the window, not at the loom but slightly apart, a spot for resting between bouts of work. On the whitewashed wall above the loom, a single shelf holds a few objects. A spare bobbin, a small oil can, a flat tin of weaver's knots, and a length of cord. Nothing is out of place. The weaver has lived and worked in this attic for many years, and the space has come to reflect the slow, methodical nature of his craft. Now he finishes his tea and sets the cup on the windowsill, where it makes a faint clink against the wood. He turns towards the loom, and his bare feet make no sound on the boards. The weaver is dressed in simple clothes, a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a plain waistcoat of brown wool, and trousers of a heavier cotton that have taken on the permanent crease of sitting. His hands, when he looks at them, are weathered but not rough, the fingers long and precise, the nails kept short for the delicate work of knotting broken threads. He approaches the loom, not with haste, but with the calm of long habit, and he runs one hand along the breastbeam, feeling the smooth wood that has been polished by the passage of countless inches of silk over its surface. He checks the warp first, walking slowly to the back of the loom, where the threads emerge from the beam, each one passing through a small loop of cord in the heddle harness. He bends close, his eyes following a single thread from the beam to the reed, checking for flaws, for any sign of fuzz or uneven tension. The warp is fine silk of a natural undyed color, the shade of unbleached linen, but with a deeper luster. In the grey morning light, it seems to glow faintly, as if it had absorbed the softness of the room and was now giving it back. The weaver touches a thread with the tip of his finger, feeling the slight spring of proper tension, then moves on to the next. A slow, repetitive inspection that has no urgency, only a quiet thoroughness. The heddles hang in two neat rows, their cords stretched taut from the shafts above. Each heddle carries a small eye of polished metal through which a single warp thread passes, and when the weaver later presses a treadle, one set of heddles will rise and the other will fall, opening a space called the shed through which the shuttle will travel. For now, though, the shed is closed, and the heddles sit in a perfect alignment that seems almost architectural. The weaver reaches out and lightly plucks one of the heddle cords, producing a low humming note that quickly fades. It is a sort of greeting to the loom, a way of acknowledging the day's work before it begins. Moving back to the front, he sits on the narrow weaver's bench, a seat that is little more than a polished plank with 4 legs, worn to a comfortable curve by years of use. The bench places him at exactly the right height relative to the breastbeam, so that his elbows can hang naturally and his forearms rest on the cloth beam. He positions himself squarely, both feet finding the treadles without having to look, and he rocks gently on the pedals a few times, testing the action. The treadles respond with a faint creak, the heddles above shifting slightly as the shed opens and closes. Everything moves in a connected way, a dance of wooden parts that have been adjusted and oiled to work in harmony. He presses one treadle down fully and the warp threads part. He releases it and they fall back together. This motion is slow and makes only the softest sounds, the thump of the treadle against its stop, the whisper of the warp threads sliding over one another. He picks up the oil can from the shelf, a small vessel of brass with a narrow spout, and he applies a single drop of linseed oil to the shuttle race, the long groove along which the shuttle will fly. Another drop goes to the pivot where the beater swings, and a third to the sword, the vertical wooden arm that connects the beater to its axle. The oil spreads in a tiny, glistening film, and the scent of linseed rises briefly, a clean and nutty smell that mixes with the beeswax and silk. He wipes the excess away with a soft cloth that lives in a pocket of his waistcoat, a rag that has been used for this purpose so many times it is saturated with oil and has taken on the dark color of aged wood. This small act of maintenance is as much a part of the morning ritual as drinking tea, the quiet preparation that settles the mind into the pace of the work to come. The shutters of the dormer window are still partially closed, and he now reaches up to swing them open a little further, letting a wider band of light fall across the loom. The light catches the warp threads and makes them gleam, and it also picks out the fine dust that hangs in the air, motes of it drifting lazily in the beam. The weaver watches the dust for a moment, observing how it moves in slow, looping spirals, never settling. Then he turns his attention back to the loom, adjusting his seat by a fraction, his body finding the position it will hold for the next several hours. The outside sounds become a little clearer now. The distant cry of a costermonger selling watercress or oranges, the call of a gull circling over the river, the rhythmic tap of a walking stick on the pavement. The weaver does not register them as distinct events. They merge into a general, low murmur, a texture of sound that fills the background and keeps the silence from being empty. Now he reaches for the shuttle. It sits in its box, a smooth, oval-ended object made of boxwood that has aged to the color of honey. A bobbin loaded with silk weft is inside, held by a simple spring mechanism that allows the thread to unwind with slight resistance. He draws the shuttle out and holds it in his right hand, feeling its weight, the way it balances perfectly across his fingers. The weft thread trails from the nose of the shuttle, a thin, almost invisible filament that will be interwoven with the warp to create the cloth. He untangles a tiny loop where the thread is caught, pulling it gently until it lies flat, and then he tucks the end under the already woven fabric at the breast beam, ready for the first pass. The cloth that is already there, woven in previous days, is rolled out of sight under the breast beam, but a small fringe of it peeks out, a few inches of plain tabby silk that feels cool and dense to the touch. The weaver pauses. His hands rest lightly on the shuttle and the beater, and he breathes evenly, his whole body still. The room holds its breath with him, the dust motes suspended, the warp threads glowing softly. Then he presses down on the right treadle, and the shed opens with a quiet rustle, one set of warp threads lifting, the other dropping, creating a triangular space that extends from the heddles to the fell of the cloth. The opening is only a few inches wide, but it is exact, a clean division between two planes of silk. He raises the shuttle and, with a gentle, practiced motion, sends it sailing across the shuttle race from right to left, his left hand catching it at the other side, the thread trailing behind. The shuttle makes a light, wooden knocking sound as it meets the box, a sound that is firm but not loud, and he immediately pulls the beater towards him, pressing the weft thread into the fell with a soft, firm swipe. The reed, a comb-like frame of thin metal teeth, pushes the new thread against the woven cloth, and the loom gives a slight, muffled thud at the impact. That single motion is the first of the day, and it hangs in the air for a moment, a ripple of activity that quickly settles back into stillness. The weaver reverses the action. Left treadle down, shed opens in the other direction, shuttle passes from left hand back to right, beater swings home. The rhythm begins, so slow that it is hardly a rhythm yet. More a sequence of deliberate, separate acts linked by the weaver's calm focus. Each pass moves a tiny length of silk weft into the cloth, less than a millimeter, and the cloth grows so slowly that the change is invisible to the eye. The weaver does not hurry. His feet press, his hands throw and catch, his fingers hold the beater steady, and the whole loom moves in a connected, gentle cycle that fills the attic with its soft, percussive sounds: treadle thump, heddle whisper, shuttle knock, beater thud. Then again treadle thump, heddle whisper, shuttle knock, beater thud, beater thud. The pauses between each sound are as important as the sounds themselves. Spaces of quiet where the thread settles, the dust shifts, and the morning light creeps another fraction across the floorboards. Outside, the day continues to mount. The church bells of Christ Church ring the hour, a sequence of deep, sonorous notes that roll over the rooftops and seep into the attic, blending with the loom's own rhythm. The sparrow returns to the gutter, chirps a few times, then leaves. The weaver weaves on, his mind not so much empty as absorbed, the endless repetition of throwing and beating, acting as a kind of anchor that holds his attention in the present moment. A small, quiet room in the vast city of London. The silk grows under his hands, a slow miracle of transformation, and the attic holds everything it needs for this peaceful, unremarkable day. The weaver continues his work, and the loom's sounds begin to steady into a sustained, gentle pulse that fills the attic like the beating of a slow heart. Each throw of the shuttle follows the one before with the precision of long practice, and there is no variation in the cadence. Right treadle down, shed opens, shuttle flies right to left with a soft wooden knock. Beater comes forward and settles the weft, then an instant of stillness before the left treadle descends. The shed reverses, the shuttle returns left to right, and the beater presses home again. These actions are so familiar to the weaver that they require no conscious thought, and his body performs them while his mind drifts into a quiet, watchful state that is neither fully awake nor anywhere close to sleep, but exists in a comfortable region between the two. The shuttle travels along the race, a narrow, polished track that runs from one side of the loom to the other, its surface darkened by years of friction and the tiny amounts of oil that the weaver applies each morning. The wood of the shuttle feels warm now, warmed by the repeated clasp of the weaver's hands, and the fine silk weft that unwinds from its bobbin does so evenly, with a faint hissing sound that is only audible when the street outside happens to fall completely silent. The weaver's palms are dry and smooth, and they leave no mark on the boxwood. His grip is light, just enough to guide the shuttle along its path and to catch it at the far end with a cupped hand that absorbs the little energy of its arrival without any slap or jar. The weft thread, as it is drawn across the open shed, gleams for an instant in the band of light falling from the dormer window before it is covered by the next closing of the warp threads and the firm press of the reed. The reed itself is a dense comb of thin metal teeth set in a wooden frame, and it hangs from the beater, a heavy swinging arm that pivots at its base. When the weaver pulls the beater towards him, the reed moves through the warp threads, pushing the newly laid weft against the woven cloth at the fell, the point where warp and weft merge into a single fabric. The resistance he feels through the beater is slight but definite, a kind of soft bounce that tells him the weft has been placed correctly, not too loose and not too tight, nestling into the exact spot where the previous thread lies. The feel of that resistance is one of the great constants of his working life, a sensation that travels up through the wood into the bones of his wrists and forearms, as familiar as the shape of his own hands. He knows this loom in the same way that a musician knows an instrument. Every creak of the timbers and every slight give in the joints, speaking to him of adjustments that need to be made, though today everything is in perfect order, and the loom asks for nothing beyond the simple continuation of its rhythm. The warp threads, those hundreds of fine silk strands stretching from the back beam through the heddles and the reed, dance a slow, repeating dance each time the treadles are pressed. As the right treadle goes down, the heddles on one shaft rise and those on the other shaft descend, and exactly half of the warp threads lift while the other half drop, creating the shed through which the shuttle can pass. When the left treadle is pressed, the action reverses, and the threads that were up go down, the threads that were down go up, binding the weft into place. The warp threads never tangle because each one moves in its own narrow channel between the teeth of the reed, a precisely ordered grid that has been set up with great care during the warping process many days ago. The weaver, even without looking closely, can sense the health of the warp by the way the heddles rise, smoothly and without any catching, by the clear sound of the reed as it slides home, and by the uniform tension that shows as a straight line of threads disappearing into the back of the loom. Now and then, as he works, he reaches forward with his free hand to brush the surface of the newly woven cloth with his fingertips, feeling the evenness of the weave. The silk is cool and very smooth, already taking on the dense, soft hand that will characterize the finished piece after it is taken from the loom and washed and pressed. The cloth at this stage is still full of a certain liveliness, a slight springiness that comes from the tension of the warp and the crimp of the weft as it bends over and under each successive warp thread. The weaver's touch is light, almost a caress, and he keeps his nails trimmed precisely for this purpose, to avoid snagging the fine fibers. Satisfied, he returns his hand to its station on the breastbeam and lets the rhythm carry him onwards, the shuttle flying back and forth in its narrow groove. The morning light strengthens by very slow degrees, moving from a pearly grey to a cleaner, paler shade that seems to sharpen the edges of the shadows. The dust motes that drift in the beam from the window are joined by tiny silk fibers that break free from the warp and float lazily in the still air, their movement hypnotic and aimless. Some of these fibers find their way to the whitewashed walls, where they cling with static electricity, forming a delicate, almost invisible fuzz that coats the plaster over many months of work. The weaver pays no attention to them. They are simply a part of the attic's atmosphere, a sign that the room is alive with the slow creation of cloth. The scent of raw silk, that dry, nutty smell, is supplemented now by the faint metallic tang of the reed's teeth and the warmer fragrance of the beeswaxed wood of the floorboards, all of it mixing into a composite aroma that is unique to this particular space. Beyond the dormer window, the sounds of Spitalfields have grown a little richer as the morning progresses. A neighbour's door opens and closes again with a solid click of an iron latch, followed by the light, quick footsteps of a woman walking towards the market, her heels tapping a staccato rhythm on the pavement. A child calls out a single high note, perhaps a name, and then falls silent. The distant cry of the costermonger returns, a rolling, melodic call that advertises fresh watercress today. The words impossible to distinguish, but the tone clear enough to convey the message. The weaver hears these sounds without listening to them, allowing them to pass through his awareness like the thin shadows of clouds that occasionally cross the window and momentarily dim the light on the loom. They are a soft, human music that underscores the mechanical music of the weaving, and the two combine into a sort of gentle, continuous background that helps rather than hinders the steady unfolding of the day. After a good while, the weaver pauses to rest his hands and to check the tension of the warp once more. He leans back on the narrow bench, his spine straightening from its slight forward curve, and he flexes his fingers a few times, feeling the comfortable ache that signals work well done. He tilts his head to look along the length of the warp threads, closing one eye to better judge their alignment, and he sees that the tension is still exactly as he set it, a smooth, taut plane without any slackness or any thread that sings a higher note than its neighbours. A warp that is too tight will break under the stress of the beater. A warp that is too loose will produce a cloth of uneven density, with sleazy spots where the weft does not pack properly. His warp is perfect, and he gives a small internal nod of satisfaction before leaning forward again and resuming his position. His feet, bare on the wooden treadles, have grown accustomed to the coolness of the wood, and he presses them down with a motion that begins in his ankles and travels up through his calves. each press a deliberate but unhurried action. The treadles themselves are connected to the heddle shafts by cords that run through pulleys fixed to the ceiling beams, and when he presses a treadle, the cords pull tight and the pulleys give a faint, dry chirp, a sound so small that it would be lost in any other room, but here, in the quiet attic, it is a regular punctuation of the rhythm. He has oiled those pulleys too many times, and the chirp is not a sign of need, but merely the voice of old, well-fitted wood and hemp cord doing their work. The weaver's shirt, a simple linen garment with full sleeves that are tied at the wrist, has pulled slightly out of his waistband with the repeated movement, and he pauses to tuck it back in with a quick, absent motion before his hands resume their dance. The waistcoat of brown wool, unbuttoned at the top, hangs comfortably from his shoulders, its fabric worn to a soft nap along the edges. His trousers are of a heavy dark cotton that does not show the dirt, and there is a patch on one knee where the cloth had thinned, sewn with small, neat stitches that match the original weaving of the trouser leg. There is no vanity in his dress, only a practical, durable simplicity that suits the work. Every piece of clothing he wears has been chosen to allow freedom of movement and to survive many hours of contact with the loom's wooden surfaces. Now the weaver turns a small wooden handle at the side of the loom, just behind the breast beam, and this handle connects to a ratchet that controls the warp beam. As he turns it, the warp advances by a tiny amount, bringing fresh warp threads into the working area and winding the newly woven cloth onto the cloth beam that sits under the breast beam, out of sight. The ratchet makes a series of soft clicks, one for each notch of the gear, and the weaver counts these clicks under his breath, knowing exactly how many are needed to keep the spacing of the weft threads consistent. He stops after 12 clicks, checks the fell of the cloth to ensure it has moved to the correct position, and then he releases the warp beam's brake and retensions the warp with a few turns of another handle at the back of the loom, a handle that is larger and requires a bit more strength to move. The warp threads tighten again with a low, almost musical groan that runs through the whole frame, and then they fall silent, ready for the next length of weaving. This small interruption, this brief spell of adjustment, has taken only a minute or two, yet it serves as a sort of punctuation mark in the long sentence of the workday. The weaver straightens up, rolls his shoulders once to loosen them, and then settles back onto the bench, finding the worn hollows that his body has created there over the years. His feet find the treadles, his hands find the shuttle, and the rhythm begins again, exactly where it left off. Treadle thump, heddle whisper, shuttle knock, beater thud, with the same patient tempo as before. There is no change in pace, no speeding up or slowing down, because the silk demands a consistent speed, a steady hand, and a calm mind. To rush would be to invite broken threads and uneven cloth. To dawdle would waste the good daylight. The weaver has learned this lesson decades ago, and now it is not a lesson, but a part of his nature. The window, still open a notch, lets in a draught of cool air that stirs the tiny fibers clinging to the wall and causes the oil lamp, unlit and hanging from a hook on the ceiling beam, to sway almost imperceptibly. The weaver feels the air on his cheek, a brief coolness that is refreshing without being cold, and he breathes deeply, taking in the scents of the street that ride on the breeze, a hint of horse, a faint whiff of bread baking somewhere nearby, the clean, damp smell of the cobbles that are only now beginning to dry in the mid-morning warmth. The air does not disturb the warp threads, which are too taut to be blown about, and it does not affect the shuttle's flight, so the weaving continues without interruption, the cloth growing steadily at its invisible rate. The weaver's mind, free to wander within the gentle cage of the rhythm, visits old, quiet memories that carry no strong emotion, only a kind of soft, faded color like old photographs looked at through a window on a rainy day. He thinks of his apprenticeship long ago, of the master weaver who had taught him to throw a shuttle, a man with a calm voice and a wooden ruler that he used to tap the bench when a mistake was made. He remembers the first piece of silk he wove on his own, a narrow ribbon of plain tabby that was full of irregularities, the weft threads bunching and spreading in a way that now makes him smile inwardly. That piece had been sold as a second, bought by a costermonger's wife for a scarf, and it had probably fallen apart within a year. But he had learned from it, and the lesson had sunk deep into his hands, so that now his cloth was as even and flawless as any woven in Spitalfields, though he would never say such a thing aloud. The light climbs higher, and the shadows shorten until they are almost directly beneath the loom. Dark pools that lie flat on the honey-colored floorboards. The dust motes have multiplied, dancing now in a brighter, warmer beam, and a small spider that lives in the corner of the window frame emerges to check its web, a gossamer construction that spans the upper pane and catches the floating silk fibers with great efficiency. The spider works quickly, patching a small tear and then retreats back into its crack. Another silent resident of the attic that asks nothing of the weaver and is given its peace in return. The weaver does not notice the spider. His gaze is fixed on the moving triangle of the shed, on the shuttle as it flies, on the beater as it arcs forward. His world has narrowed to the width of the loom, the rest of the room hovering at the edges of his perception like a half-remembered dream. The woven cloth rolled now under the breastbeam is accumulating into a small cylinder of dense fabric that will eventually be cut from the loom and taken to the merchant's warehouse for inspection and sale. The weaver does not think about that future event. He thinks only of the present pass, the present thread, the present soft thud of the beater. His day is made of thousands of these tiny moments, each one identical to the last, and their very sameness is what makes them so restful, so free from the anxiety of decision or the pressure of change. He is, in this attic, a fixed point in a turning world, and the loom is his anchor, his companion, his quiet, wooden world that awakens fully with each press of the treadle and sleeps with the setting of the sun. So the morning wears on in its slow, steady way, measured not by the clock but by the length of silk that appears, thread by thread, on the breastbeam. The weaver weaves, the shuttle flies, the warp rises and falls, and the attic holds them all in its calm embrace, asking nothing more than what is already given. The shuttle is now the center of the weaver's attention, and it moves through the shed with a smooth, gliding motion that seems almost independent of the hands that throw and catch it. The boxwood has grown warm from constant handling, its surface taking on the slight sheen that comes from the friction of dry palms and the natural oils of the skin. The weaver holds it lightly, his fingers curling around its tapered end without gripping, and when he sends it across the race, the action flows through his wrist and forearm with the ease of a motion performed countless times before. The shuttle does not wobble or deviate from its straight path. It flies true along the polished groove, and the weft thread pays out behind it in a fine, even strand that glints for a moment before disappearing into the warp. The weft thread itself is a single filament of silk, unbroken and unknotted, wound onto the small bobbin that sits inside the shuttle, held by a thin metal pin that allows it to rotate freely. As the shuttle moves, the bobbin turns, and the thread unwinds with a faint, high-whispering sound that is almost too quiet to hear, a sound that would be lost if not for the deep silence of the attic. The tension of the weft is controlled by a small eyelet and a series of tiny posts inside the shuttle that guide the thread and prevent it from tangling or snagging, and the weaver has adjusted these guides many times over the years, until they are set exactly to his liking, producing a thread that lies in the shed with just the right amount of slack, enough to form a proper selvage at the edge of the cloth without pulling the warp threads out of alignment. When the shuttle reaches the end of its journey and knocks softly against the box at the far side of the loom, the weaver's waiting hand closes around it immediately, the fingers curling over the smooth wood and drawing it to a stop without any jarring or bouncing. The box itself is a hollow chamber lined with a strip of leather that cushions the arrival of the shuttle and gives the sound its characteristic low, dull quality, a sound like a padded mallet striking a block of dense wood. The weaver hears this sound twice with each complete cycle of the weave, once on the right side and once on the left, and the two knocks are not quite identical because the shuttle enters the right box at a slightly different angle than the left box, a tiny difference that only someone who had sat at this loom for years would ever notice. The weaver notices but does not think about it. The asymmetry is simply part of the loom's personality, as familiar as the face of a friend. After each knock comes the swing of the beater, the heavy wooden arm that carries the reed forward to press the new weft thread into the fell. The weaver grasps the beater by its smooth handle, a turned piece of beech that fits comfortably in his palm, and he pulls it towards him with a motion that begins at the shoulder and flows through the elbow and wrist in a single, uninterrupted arc. The reed set into the beater moves through the warp threads with a faint metallic rustle, and when it reaches the fell, it presses the weft thread firmly against the previous one. the two threads lying side by side in the dense embrace of the warp. The weaver holds the beater for a brief instant at the point of contact, feeling the slight bounce back of the cloth, and then he lets it swing away, the beater returning to its resting position under its own weight, ready for the next pass. This sequence of movements is so regular, so unvarying, that it becomes a kind of physical meditation, a mantra spoken not with the voice but with the whole body. The weaver's breathing falls into synchrony with the loom's rhythm, each exhale coinciding with the swing of the beater, each inhale filling the pause between one pass and the next. His heartbeat, too, seems to slow to match the tempo of the work, and the small tensions that might have gathered in his shoulders during the night dissolve under the gentle, repetitive motion. The loom, in this way, is not merely a tool but a companion, a presence that guides the weaver into a state of calm attentiveness that he cannot achieve in any other way. The silk cloth that is accumulating on the breastbeam now measures a little more than a hand's breadth from the fell, a section of plain tabby weave that is even in every particular. The surface of the cloth is smooth and slightly cool under the weaver's occasional touch, with a soft sheen that catches the light in a way that reveals the perfect regularity of the weave. Each warp thread and each weft thread are exactly the same thickness, the same degree of twist, and they interlace at precise right angles to form a fabric that is strong yet supple, dense yet breathable. The color is a natural ecru, the shade of unbleached silk before it is degummed and finished, a warm off-white that has hints of cream and the faintest suggestion of gold in certain lights. The weaver does not think about the eventual destination of this cloth, whether it will become a gentleman's cravat, or a lady's gown, or a length of lining for a coat made in a shop on Regent Street. He thinks only of the threads immediately in front of him, the ones that his hands are touching right now. The warp threads that stretch from the backbeam to the fell are beginning to show a fine coating of size, a protective substance that had been applied to them before the warping process to strengthen them against the abrasion of the heddles and the reed. The size is made from a mixture of flour and water, boiled to a thin paste and applied with a sponge, and it gives the warp threads a slightly stiff, papery feel that the weaver can detect when he brushes his fingers across them. As the weaving progresses, the size slowly wears away, leaving the silk soft and pliable in the woven cloth, and tiny particles of dried size dust the race and the shuttle box and the hem of the weaver's apron. These particles are too small to see individually, but over the hours they accumulate into a fine, pale powder that the weaver will brush away at the end of the day with a soft cloth and a small brush made of horsehair. The attic light has shifted again, moving now from the pale clarity of mid-morning into the fuller, more golden illumination of the hour before noon. The sun, climbing towards its zenith, sends a beam that falls directly onto the loom through the dormer window, and the warp threads, caught in this bright light, seem to glow from within, their translucent silk fibers transmitting the light along their length so that the whole warp appears as luminous plain, a sheet of captured sunlight. The weaver squints slightly against the brightness and adjusts his position on the bench, shifting a little to one side so that his shadow does not fall across the fell and obscure his view of the cloth. The bench creaks softly as he moves, a sound of old wood settling, and then it is quiet again, except for the steady, rhythmic sounds of the weaving. In the street below, the morning activity has reached its peak, a gentle peak by modern standards, but still the busiest part of the day for Spitalfields. Carts and barrows pass more frequently now, their wheels rumbling over the cobbles, and the voices of vendors and neighbors mingle into a low, continuous murmur that floats up through the window. A woman laughs somewhere nearby, a bright, short sound that is cut off quickly, and a dog barks 3 times in a distant courtyard, and then falls silent. A clock strikes the hour from Christ Church, its bell tolling 11 times with a deep, resonant note that hangs in the air for a long moment after each strike, and the weaver, without pausing in his work, counts the strokes automatically, his mind registering the time and then letting it go. The hour does not matter to the silk. The silk knows only the steady accumulation of weft threads, the slow, patient growth of the cloth. Now the weaver pauses for a moment to take up a small brush that hangs from a nail on the side of the loom, a brush with a wooden handle and stiff bristles that he uses to clean the reed. The reed's metal teeth, thin as needles and set close together, can become clogged with fragments of size and loose silk fibers over time, and if the build-up becomes too great, the warp threads will begin to catch and fray. The weaver leans forward and runs the brush gently along the length of the reed, working from one side to the other with short, careful strokes that dislodge the debris without damaging the delicate warp threads that pass through the gaps. A small cloud of pale dust rises from the reed and drifts away into the sunbeam, sparkling for a moment before dissipating, and the weaver watches it with a detached, peaceful attention before setting the brush aside and returning his hands to the shuttle and the beater. The shuttle, when he picks it up again, feels exactly as it did before, the same weight and warmth and perfect balance, and the weaving resumes as if there had been no interruption at all. The threads continue their patient dance, the shuttle continues its steady flight, and the attic continues to hold everything in its quiet embrace, the minutes passing without being counted, the sunlight creeping imperceptibly across the floorboards, the dust motes floating in their endless, slow spirals. The weaver weaves, and the world outside fades further into the background, becoming nothing more than a soft, distant hum that accompanies the loom's gentle knocking and the rustle of the warp threads opening and closing, over and over, without haste and without end. The warp threads are the soul of the cloth, and they stretch from the back beam to the fell in a long, taut plane that shimmers under the attic light like the surface of still water. There are over 2,000 individual threads in this particular warp, each one a single filament of silk that was unwound from a cocoon somewhere far away in China or perhaps in the Italian countryside, and then twisted with other filaments to form a thread of sufficient strength to withstand the tensions of the loom. The weaver did not make these threads himself. They came to him on large spools from the throster, already twisted and sized and wound onto the warp beam by a warper whose careful work made the weaver's own work possible. But now, in this attic, these threads are entirely under his care, and he feels a quiet sense of responsibility for each one, a duty that expresses itself in the constant, gentle attention he gives to their condition. The path that each warp thread takes through the loom is a journey of many stages, and the weaver knows every stage intimately. From the warp beam at the back of the loom, the threads rise in a flat sheet and pass over a wooden roller that keeps them aligned and prevents them from rubbing against the beam's edge. Then they travel forward, still in their precise order, and enter the heddles. Those rows of cord with their tiny polished eyes, each thread passing through a single eye. The heddles are arranged in 2 shafts, and each shaft controls a different set of threads. The odd-numbered threads go through the eyes of the first shaft, the even-numbered through the eyes of the second, so that when one shaft rises and the other falls, the 2 sets of threads separate and create the shed. After the heddles, the threads continue their forward journey and pass through the reed, the dense comb of metal teeth set in the beater, with 1 or 2 threads occupying each gap between the teeth. The reed not only presses the weft into place, but also keeps the warp threads evenly spaced across the width of the cloth, setting the final density of the weave. Then, at last, the threads reach the fell and become part of the woven cloth, their long journey over, their purpose fulfilled. The weaver, as he works, occasionally glances along the length of the warp, checking the alignment of the threads as they pass through the heddles and the reed. He is looking for any crossed threads, places where 2 adjacent warp threads have twisted around each other and will no longer move freely. A cross thread will cause an uneven shed, a gap that does not open cleanly, and the shuttle will catch on it and perhaps break the thread entirely. So far, he sees none. The warp was well made and well wound, and the heddles were drawn in with careful attention by the same warper who had prepared the beam. The threads rise and fall in their alternating pattern with the precision of a regiment, each one knowing its place and keeping to it without fail. The tension of the warp is maintained by a system of weights and levers at the back of the loom, a simple but effective arrangement that the weaver can adjust by turning a wooden handle. The warp beam itself is fitted with a brake, a leather strap that grips the axle and prevents the beam from turning freely under the pull of the threads, and the release of this brake allows the weaver to advance the warp when the woven cloth is wound forward. The tension must be strong enough to give the cloth a firm structure, but not so strong that the threads snap under the stress of the beater, and the weaver has found the right balance through years of trial and error. He listens to the warp as much as he looks at it, hearing in the low hum of the threads when they are plucked by the heddles a note that tells him whether the tension is correct. A flat, dull note means the threads are too loose and the cloth will be sleazy and weak. A high, sharp note means they are too tight and breakages will follow. The note he hears now is a soft, resonant tone, like the string of a cello played very quietly, and he is satisfied. Now, as he throws the shuttle and beats the weft, he notices a tiny irregularity in the warp, a single thread that seems slightly fuzzier than its neighbors, a sign that the size has been rubbed away and the individual filaments are beginning to separate. He stops the loom and leans forward to inspect the thread, his eyes narrowing as he follows its path from the fell back through the reed and into the heddles. The fuzziness is not yet a break, but it could become one if the thread continues to fray, and a broken warp thread is a problem that requires careful attention to repair. The weaver reaches for a small tool that hangs on a cord from the loom frame, a weaver's hook made of a thin wire with a tiny barb at its end, and he also takes up a spare bobbin of warp silk from the shelf above his head. With the patience of long practice, he begins the slow process of replacing the damaged thread before it can fail. First, he ties the spare bobbin to the loom frame at the back near the warp beam and draws a length of thread from it. Then he finds the fuzzy thread at the fell and cuts it with a small pair of snips that he keeps in his waistcoat pocket, the blades sharp and precise. He ties the new thread to the cut end with a weaver's knot, a tiny, tight knot that will not slip and will pass through the heddles and the reed without catching, and he trims the loose ends with the snips, leaving a neat, almost invisible join. Now he takes the weaver's hook and, working from the front of the loom, inserts it through the empty eye of the heddle from which the old thread was cut, and he catches the new thread with the tiny barb and draws it carefully through the eye, pulling it forward until the knot appears at the heddle. He repeats the process with the reed, threading the new thread through the correct gap between the teeth, and then he pulls the thread forward to the fell and tucks the end into the woven cloth, ready to be incorporated into the weave. The whole operation has taken only a few minutes, and the weaver inspects his work with a calm, practiced eye, satisfied that the new thread is correctly tensioned and aligned. He returns the hook to its cord, brushes a stray fragment of silk from the race, and resumed his weaving, the rhythm picking up exactly where it left off. The dust motes continue their endless, lazy dance in the beam of sunlight, which has moved a little further across the floorboards and now illuminates a different patch of the woven cloth on the breast beam. The new patch of cloth, seen in this light, reveals the subtle variations in the natural ecru color, the way the warp and weft threads catch the light at slightly different angles and create a faint, shimmering pattern that seems to shift as the angle of view changes. The weaver, looking down at the cloth from his seat on the bench, sees this pattern as a soft, moving ripple that travels across the surface of the silk, a reminder that the cloth, even in its simplicity, is a living thing that responds to the light and the air. He runs a finger over the cloth, feeling the cool, smooth texture that characterizes a well-woven tabby, and he nods slightly, the tiny gesture of approval that no one else would see or understand. The warp threads, now that one of them has been replaced, seem to settle back into their rhythm with a renewed sense of order, the heddles rising and falling without the slightest hesitation. The weaver's hands move through the familiar sequence, and his mind, released from the brief concentration of the repair, returns to its calm, drifting state. He thinks about the nature of silk, about the way it comes from such a small and humble source, a worm spinning a cocoon, and yet becomes something so fine and strong and lasting. He thinks about the thousands of weavers who have worked at looms like this one over the centuries, in places far from Spitalfields, in Lyons and Lucca, and ancient China, each one throwing a shuttle and beating a reed and watching the cloth grow under their hands. These thoughts are not specific or vivid. They are more like a gentle current that flows beneath the surface of his mind, a background awareness of being part of a great and ancient tradition that stretches back beyond memory. The room itself seems to breathe around him, the old timbers of the roof expanding almost imperceptibly in the warmth of the approaching noon, the floorboards settling with a soft creak that sounds like a whispered comment. The spider in the corner of the window has retreated into its crack, satisfied with its morning's work, and the dust motes continue to drift, some of them landing on the weaver's sleeve and forming a pale, almost invisible dusting that will be brushed away at the end of the day. The scent of the attic has deepened with the warmth, the beeswax and linseed and raw silk, combining with the faint, dry smell of the old wood and the distant hint of bread from the bakery down the street. And the weaver breathes it all in with each slow, steady inhale, as much a part of the room as the loom itself. The cloth grows thread by thread, and the warp threads continue their patient journey from the back beam to the fell, passing through the heddles and the reed, rising and falling in their alternating dance, each one a tiny part of a larger whole that will outlast the weaver and the attic, and perhaps even the house itself. And the weaver weaves on, his hands and feet moving in their gentle, repetitive rhythm, his mind at peace, the morning slowly arcing towards noon. The weaver sets the shuttle down for a moment and rises from the bench, his knees making a soft popping sound as he straightens his legs after the long sitting. He walks the few steps to the dormer window, his bare feet silent on the smooth boards, and he leans his shoulder against the frame, looking out onto the street below, through the wavy glass that distorts the view in subtle flowing ripples. The window is small and set deep into the roof, its frame painted a faded white that has yellowed with age, and the sill is wide enough to rest an elbow on, worn to a shallow groove by countless such moments of observation over the years. The weaver stands there, half in shadow and half in the bright noon light, and he lets his eyes wander over the familiar scene with the quiet appreciation of someone who has looked at the same view 1,000 times and still finds it restful. Fournier Street stretches away to the left and right, a straight, broad thoroughfare lined with the handsome brick houses that were built by the Huguenot silk weavers who came to Spitalfields many generations ago. The houses are tall and narrow, 3 stories high with attics above, and their facades are of a warm reddish-brown brick that has darkened over the centuries to a deep, muted tone, the color of dried autumn leaves. Each house has a set of large windows on the lower floors, the kind of windows that were designed to let in the maximum amount of light for the weavers who worked at their looms, and above the windows are flat arches of rubbed brick, their joints so fine that they seem drawn rather than built. The weaver knows these houses as well as he knows his own face, every variation in the brickwork and every slight irregularity in the roofline, and he finds comfort in their solid, enduring presence. Directly opposite, on the other side of the street, a house very like his own shows its face to the afternoon, its windows gleaming dully in the light. On the second floor, a woman is visible through the glass, moving slowly about some domestic task, her figure a soft blurred shape that comes and goes. Below her, on the ground floor, a shop front displays a modest array of goods in the window, bolts of cloth perhaps, or ribbons and trims, the colors muted by the glass and the angle of the sun. The shop door is closed, and a small bell hangs above it, silent for now. The weaver does not know the woman in the window, has never spoken to her, but he has seen her many times over the years, and her presence is a small part of the quiet tapestry of the street, a thread that is always there, unobtrusive and constant. Further down, towards the corner where Fournier Street meets Brick Lane, a boy is rolling a wooden hoop along the cobbles with a short stick, his legs pumping as he runs, the hoop wobbling and clattering with a sound that rises and falls as it passes over the uneven stones. The boy's voice carries up to the attic, a high, clear call of pleasure that has no words, only the pure sound of a child at play. A woman, perhaps his mother or an older sister, walks behind him at a slower pace, a basket over her arm, her attention divided between the boy and the display of vegetables on a costermonger's barrow that has been set up at the curb. The costermonger himself, a man in a flat cap and a heavy apron, is arranging his wares with slow, deliberate movements, his hands lifting each cabbage and turnip and setting it down in its proper place, building a small green mountain on the wooden slats. The weaver watches the boy and the hoop with a faint, distant smile, the kind of expression that barely moves the muscles of the face, and he remembers, not as a sharp memory, but as a vague, pleasant impression, his own childhood in a street much like this one, the feel of a hoop stick in his hand, and the sound of his own running feet on the cobbles. That was a long time ago, in a different part of the city, but the sensation of it lingers in his body, the echo of a rhythm that has never quite left him. He shifts his weight from one foot to the other, and the floorboard beneath him creaks softly, a sound that the attic has made 1,000 times and will make 1,000 times more. Beyond the costermonger, at the far end of the street, the spire of Christ Church rises into the pale sky, a towering construction of white stone that seems almost impossibly tall when seen from the low angle of the attic window. The spire is the great landmark of Spitalfields, visible from every street and alley, and its presence gives a sense of order and stability to the neighborhood, a fixed point around which the daily life of the area revolves. The bells are silent now, resting between the hours, but the weaver can almost feel their potential, the weight of the great metal bodies hanging in the belfry, waiting for the next appointed time to send their deep, resonant notes rolling out over the rooftops. The sky behind the spire is a soft, washed blue, the color of faded linen, with a few high clouds that move so slowly they seem to be standing still. The weaver's gaze drifts back to the street directly below his window, and he notices a woman shaking a mat out of a doorway, a small woven mat of the kind that sits just inside the threshold to catch the dirt from boots. She holds it by one corner and flaps it twice, and a puff of dust billows out into the sunlight, the particles glittering for a moment before they drift down to the cobbles and disappear. The woman turns and goes back inside, closing the door behind her with a firm, solid sound that echoes briefly between the brick walls and then fades. A cat, a lean ginger creature with a white patch on its chest, emerges from an alleyway and trots across the street with its tail held high, pausing once to sniff at a discarded crust of bread before continuing on its way. The weaver watches the cat until it disappears around a corner, and then he shifts his gaze again, taking in the whole scene with a slow, sweeping glance that asks for nothing and expects nothing. The warmth of the noon sun falls on his face through the glass, and he closes his eyes for a moment, feeling the heat on his eyelids and the slight breeze that finds its way through the gap where the window is open. A crack. The sounds of the street blend together into a gentle, continuous murmur that has no distinct parts. The distant rumble of a cart, the faint cry of a vendor, the cluck of a pigeon on the roof ridge, the soft murmur of voices from the shop front below, the rustle of the breeze in the eaves. These sounds are not separate events, but a single flowing current that washes over the weaver and then passes on, leaving no trace. He opens his eyes again, and the light seems brighter for a moment, the colors of the street more vivid, and then everything settles back into its accustomed tone. He remains at the window for a while longer, not counting the minutes, not thinking of the loom that waits behind him, simply being present in this quiet, sunlit moment. The boy with the hoop has turned the corner and disappeared. The costermonger has sold a cabbage to the woman with the basket, and the ginger cat has found a patch of sun on a doorstep and curled up into a tight, contented ball. The street settles into its afternoon rhythm, a slower, lazier tempo than the busy morning, and the weaver feels his own breathing slow to match it. Then, with a small sigh that is not of sadness or weariness, but of simple contentment, he turns away from the window and walks back to the loom, his feet finding the familiar path without the need for sight. He settles onto the bench, adjusts a cushion, and picks up the shuttle, and the weaving resumes, the rhythm picking up again as if it had never stopped, the threads dancing their slow dance, the attic wrapping itself around him once more. The cloth under the weaver's left hand has grown to the length of his forearm, a smooth, even expanse of plain tabby silk that slides through his fingers with a cool, fluid touch. He pauses in his throwing to run his palm over the surface, feeling the slight ridges where each weft thread crosses the warp, a texture so fine that it is almost imperceptible, more a sensation of order than of roughness. The silk has a particular hand at this stage of its creation, still slightly stiff from the size in the warp, but already showing the softness and drape that will emerge fully when the cloth is washed and finished. The weaver knows this hand as well as he knows the feel of his own skin, and he can tell by touch alone whether the weave is true, the tension even, the selvage straight. His fingers travel to the left selvage edge, the edge of the cloth where the weft thread turns and returns, forming a neat, firm border that prevents the fabric from unraveling. The selvage is slightly thicker than the body of the cloth, and it has a different texture, a corded feel that comes from the double passage of the weft thread at each edge. The weaver examines it with his fingertips, tracing the tiny loops and bumps that mark the turn of the shuttle, and he finds it perfect, without any loose threads or puckers. A good selvage is the signature of a skilled weaver, a detail that many overlook but that the merchants and the tailors notice, and the weaver takes a quiet pride in this small, functional beauty. He then checks the right selved edge in the same way, his fingers moving slowly across the width of the cloth, and he gives another of his tiny, barely perceptible nods. The act of touching the cloth is not only an inspection but also a kind of communion, a moment of direct contact with the thing that is emerging from the loom. The weaver's hands are the first to feel the silk in its finished form, before any merchant or cutter or seamstress, before any gentleman wears it around his neck or any lady drapes it over her shoulders. This brief private connection between maker and made object is something that the weaver values, but has never put into words, a quiet satisfaction that lives in the hands and not in the mind. He withdraws his touch and returns his fingers to the shuttle, and the rhythm resumes, the shuttle flying across the race, the beater swinging forward, the threads interlacing in their endless, patient pattern. Now the weaver notices that the fell of the cloth has advanced to a point where the warp beam needs to be released again. Another few inches of warp to be brought forward and another length of woven cloth to be wound onto the cloth beam. He stops the loom and reaches for the wooden handle at the side, the same handle he turned earlier in the morning, and he begins to crank it slowly, listening to the soft clicking of the ratchet as the gears engage and turn. Each click represents a tiny increment of movement, and the weaver counts them under his breath, a low murmur that blends with the sounds of the room. The warp threads, released from their tension, sag slightly, and the whole loom seems to exhale, the wooden frame creaking with the change of stress. Then the weaver moves to the back of the loom and turns the larger handle that controls the warp beam brake, tightening the threads once more until they hum at the correct pitch. The note he listens for with his head tilted slightly to one side. The retensioning process is a small ritual that the weaver performs several times each day, and it has its own measured pace, its own sequence of actions that are never rushed. He checks the alignment of the warp threads as they pass over the back roller, making sure that none have shifted or crossed, and he runs a finger along the roller itself, feeling for any roughness or burr that might catch a thread. The roller is smooth and true, worn to a soft polish by the passage of miles of silk over its surface, and the threads lie flat and even across its width. Satisfied, the weaver returns to the front of the loom, seats himself on the bench, and presses the right treadle down, watching the shed open with the same clean, precise separation as before. The loom is ready, and the work continues. The noon light has flattened now, losing the angled golden quality of the earlier hours and becoming a more neutral, diffused illumination that fills the attic evenly, without strong shadows or bright highlights. This is the light of the middle of the day, a steady, unchanging light that seems to suspend time, to hold the world in a kind of amber stillness that is deeply peaceful. The dust motes, still drifting in their aimless patterns, are less visible in this flat light, but they are still there, a fine suspended haze that gives the air a slight texture, a faint solidity that you could almost reach out and touch. The weaver is accustomed to this light, and he works well in it, his hands moving with the same sure, unhurried precision, the silk growing slowly on the breast beam. The temperature in the attic has risen slightly with the advance of the day, the sun warming the slates of the roof until the air takes on a comfortable, drowsy warmth that is not at all unpleasant. The weaver feels the warmth on his neck and shoulders, and he pauses to loosen the top button of his waistcoat, a small adjustment that he makes without thinking. A bead of sweat forms at his temple, and he wipes it away with the back of his hand, the motion quick and habitual, interrupting nothing. The warmth is a familiar companion, present in the summer months and absent in the winter, when the little iron stove would be lit and the attic would fill with the dry, crackling heat of burning coal. A different kind of warmth, but equally a part of the rhythm of the seasons. The weaver's mind, still adrift on the gentle current of the work, turns now to the technical details of the weave, the small, precise measurements and calculations that underlie the apparent simplicity of the cloth. He thinks about the set of the warp, the number of threads per inch, which for this particular silk is 48, a dense but not excessive count that will produce a fabric of good body and smooth surface. He thinks about the pick count, the number of weft threads per inch, which should match the warp set exactly to produce a balanced tabby weave. He does not count these things consciously as he works, but his body knows them, his feet and hands maintaining the precise rhythm that will produce the correct density. If he were to stop and measure the cloth with a pick glass, a small magnifying lens that he keeps in a drawer, he would find that the count is perfect, each inch containing exactly 48 weft threads, each one laid parallel to its neighbors, each one beaten home with exactly the same pressure. This precision is not the result of conscious effort, but of deep embodied knowledge, a wisdom that lives in the muscles and the bones, rather than in the thinking mind. The weaver has woven so many yards of silk in his life that his body has become a kind of loom itself, a mechanism of remarkable accuracy that operates below the level of thought. His hands know when the shuttle has flown true, his feet know when the treadle has been pressed to the right depth, his ears know when the beater has struck the fell with the correct force. This bodily knowledge is the true mastery of the craft, and it cannot be taught in words or learned from books. It can only be acquired through years of patient, repetitive practice, through the slow accumulation of thousands of hours at the bench. The silk itself seems to cooperate with this embodied knowledge, responding to the weaver's touch with a kind of docile willingness, as if the threads understood their role and were content to play it. The warp opens cleanly with each press of the treadle. The weft glides through without snagging, and the beater settles the thread into place with a soft, definitive thud that speaks of a job properly done. There is no struggle between weaver and material, no resistance or perversity in the silk. There is only a calm, orderly collaboration that produces, minute by minute, a few more inches of plain, beautiful cloth. The weaver is grateful for this smoothness, though he does not express gratitude in any obvious way. He simply continues to work, his hands steady, his breathing slow, his attention fully absorbed by the present moment. Outside, the world continues its own slow rhythms, the street below settling into the quiet of the early afternoon. The costermonger has packed up his barrow and trundled it away to another corner. The boy with the hoop has gone home for his dinner, and the ginger cat has shifted its position on the doorstep to follow a shrinking patch of shade. The street is almost empty now, a long, sunlit corridor of brick and cobble that waits in patient stillness for the next pulse of activity. A single figure, a man in a dark coat, walks slowly along the pavement, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, and then he too is gone, disappearing around the bend towards the market. The silence that follows is not an empty silence, but a full one, a silence made of the warm air and the solid brick and the distant constant hum of the great city beyond. The weaver hears this silence and is comforted by it, though he does not stop to listen or to remark upon it. The silence is simply the background against which the loom's gentle knocking and the rustle of the threads are drawn, a canvas of quiet that makes the small sounds of the work stand out with a pleasing clarity. The day has reached its still point, the hour when the morning's energy has ebbed and the afternoon's activity has not yet begun, and the attic, holding its weaver and his loom, seems to float in this stillness like a boat on a calm sea, going nowhere, asking nothing, simply being. And the weaver weaves on through this quiet hour, adding his own small, steady rhythm to the great, slow pulse of the city, a tiny, human heartbeat in the vast, peaceful body of the world. A small bell rings from the direction of the French church on the corner, its note high and clear, cutting through the warm afternoon air and finding its way into the attic through the open gap of the dormer window. The sound is not loud or insistent. It is a gentle, silvery chime that seems to hang in the stillness for a moment before fading, a reminder of the hour and of the world beyond the loom. The weaver hears the bell and lets his hands come to rest, the shuttle pausing in its flight, the beater swinging gently back to its upright position. He straightens on the bench and rolls his shoulders in a slow, circular motion, feeling the muscles across his upper back loosen and stretch after the long morning of steady work. The morning's weaving is done, and the weaver sets the shuttle carefully into its wooden box at the side of the loom, the boxwood making a soft, definitive click as it settles into its accustomed place. He rises from the bench, his legs a little stiff from the hours of sitting, and he takes a moment to stand still in the center of the attic, letting his body adjust to the change of posture. The flat noon light falls on him from the window, and he blinks once. Slowly, his eyes adjusting to the wider focus after the narrow concentration of the work. Then he walks to the small table that stands near the window, a plain, sturdy piece of furniture with a scrubbed top and a single drawer. and he begins to prepare his midday meal. From the drawer he takes a linen cloth, folded neatly into a square, and he spreads it on the table with a smooth, practiced motion. Then he brings out the simple provisions that he carries up each morning from the kitchen below: a small loaf of bread, today a round cod with a crackled, floury crust, a wedge of pale yellow cheese wrapped in a piece of muslin, and a single apple, its skin mottled red and green, cool from sitting in the larder. He also retrieves a brown earthenware jug of water and a cup of the same humble material, the jug beaded with condensation that catches the light and makes the surface gleam like polished stone. The weaver arranges these items on the cloth with a quiet, unhurried precision, not from any sense of fussiness, but simply from a habit of order, a preference for things to be in their proper place. He breaks the bread with his hands rather than cutting it, the crust cracking and yielding to reveal the soft, pale crumb inside, and a faint wisp of steam rises from the fresh interior, the bread having been baked only a few hours ago in the brick oven of the bakery down the street. The smell of the bread fills the corner of the attic, a warm, yeasty fragrance that mixes pleasantly with the dry scent of the silk and the linseed oil. The weaver takes a piece of the bread and a slice of the cheese, which he cuts with a small worn knife that he takes from his pocket, the blade thin and sharp from many honings, the handle of dark wood shaped to fit his grip. The cheese is firm and slightly crumbly, with a mild, nutty flavor that complements the sweetness of the fresh bread, and he eats slowly, chewing each mouthful with the same deliberate, patient rhythm that he brings to his weaving. The apple he saves for last, turning it over in his hand once, and feeling its smooth, taut skin before biting into it, with a crisp, juicy crack that sounds very loud in the quiet attic. The juice is cool and faintly tart, and he wipes a drop from his chin with the back of his hand, a gesture so habitual that he does not notice it. He eats the apple all the way down to the core, turning it in his fingers to find the last bits of white flesh, and then he places the core neatly on the cloth, where it will wait until he wraps up the remains and takes them downstairs at the end of the day. The entire meal is simple and brief, unremarkable in every way, yet it is a pause that the weaver looks forward to each day, a small island of stillness in the long, steady river of the work. When he has finished eating, he pours a cup of water from the earthenware jug and drinks it in slow, measured swallows, the water cool and clean, drawn from the well that serves the street and carried up in buckets by the housemaid. The water has a faint mineral taste, a suggestion of the chalk and clay that lie deep under the city, and it is refreshing without being cold enough to shock the throat. He sets the cup down and wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he carefully brushes the crumbs from the table into his palm and carries them to the window, where he scatters them onto the sill for the sparrows that will come looking later. The sparrows are not there now, but they will find the crumbs, and the weaver likes the small, silent transaction of this gesture, the giving of something that would otherwise be wasted to the small, busy lives outside. He stands at the window again, as he did earlier. But this time the street presents a different face, the face of the early afternoon, when the morning's business has concluded and the evening's activity has not yet stirred. The cobbles are dry now, their dark, damp color faded to a lighter, dusty gray, and the sun falls directly on them, making the street seem wider and emptier than it did in the morning. A few people walk along the pavement, their pace slow and unhurried, and their voices, when they speak, are low and relaxed, the voices of people who have finished their work for the moment and are taking their ease. The ginger cat has disappeared from its doorstep, retreating to some hidden, cool place to sleep through the warmest part of the day, and the only sign of life on the opposite side of the street is a thin wisp of smoke that rises from a chimney pot and drifts away into the pale sky, thinning and spreading until it is indistinguishable from the air itself. The weaver stands in the window alcove, one shoulder leaning against the frame, and he watches the slow drift of a few high clouds across the blue, their shapes changing almost imperceptibly as they move. One cloud, a long, flat formation that reminds him vaguely of a length of unrolled silk, separates into two pieces and then reforms into a single mass, the whole process taking so long that he might have imagined it if he had not been watching with such calm, unfocused attention. The clouds are so far away and so weightless that their movement seems to have nothing to do with the world of looms and cobbles and fresh bread, and the weaver lets his thoughts drift up to join them, his mind becoming as light and airy as the vapor in the sky. Behind him, the attic settles into its own quiet pause, the loom standing dark and silent, the warp threads gleaming dully in the diffuse light, the shuttle resting in its box. The dust motes have settled slightly in the still air, their dance slowed almost to a halt, and the small spider in the corner has emerged again to tend its web, its movements tiny and precise in the shadows. The attic, without the rhythm of the weaving to animate it, seems to hold its breath, waiting for the weaver to return, and in the silence the tiny sounds of the old house become audible. A floorboard creaking somewhere below, the faint rustle of a curtain in a draught, the distant, muffled murmur of voices from the kitchen. These sounds are so quiet and so familiar that they barely register, flowing through the weaver's awareness like the clouds through the sky. A woman's voice, soft and indistinct, rises from the room below, the voice of the weaver's wife, or perhaps a neighbor who has stopped by to share a pot of tea in a few minutes of quiet conversation. The words are impossible to make out, but the tone is calm and unhurried, the rise and fall of a voice speaking of ordinary things, of meals and weather and the small doings of the street. The weaver listens without listening, the sound of the voice blending with the other background noises to form a gentle, human texture that is as comforting as the warmth of the sun on his face. Then the voice fades, a door closes somewhere, and the silence returns, deeper than before. The weaver's thoughts, still adrift, turn idly to the afternoon's work that lies ahead, the continuation of the same steady, patient weaving that has filled the morning. He does not feel any urgency or reluctance about returning to the loom. The work is simply there, waiting for him, a familiar and undemanding presence. He thinks about the length of cloth that he will produce by the end of the day, perhaps another foot or so if the rhythm holds steady, a small but satisfying addition to the bolt that is slowly accumulating on the cloth beam. He thinks about the silk itself, the way the natural ecru color will appear when the cloth is taken from the loom and held up to the light, a warm, soft glow that no dyed fabric can quite match. These thoughts are not sharp or detailed. They are more like the gentle lapping of water against the side of a boat, a rhythmic, soothing presence that asks for nothing and demands no response. After a time, the weaver stirs from his place by the window and walks back to the little table, where he folds the linen cloth around the remains of his meal and tucks the bundle back into the drawer. He pours one more cup of water and drinks it standing up, his eyes roaming over the familiar shapes of the attic, the loom and the stool and the shelf and the whitewashed walls. Then he sets the cup aside, rolls his shoulders once more, and crosses to the loom, his bare feet making no sound on the boards. He settles onto the bench, adjusts the cushion, and picks up the shuttle, feeling its smooth warmth against his palm. The pause is over, and the afternoon's work is ready to begin. The warp threads waiting patiently, the beater hanging still, the whole loom poised in a moment of perfect, silent readiness before the rhythm resumes. The afternoon shuttle song begins where the morning song left off, with the same steady pulse filling the attic, the same gentle knocking and rustling and creaking that have become as much a part of the room as the beams and the floorboards. The shuttle flies from right to left to right, and each passage adds another thread to the cloth, another tiny increment of width that is invisible to the eye but real, cumulative. A slow building of substance from nothing but thread and motion and time. The weaver's hands move in their accustomed pattern, and the sounds they make blend together into a low, continuous music, a kind of lullaby for the waking mind. The heat of the afternoon has settled into the attic now, a comfortable, drowsy warmth that wraps around the weaver like a blanket. The sun has moved past its zenith and begun its slow descent towards the west, and the light that comes through the dormer window has taken on a slightly deeper tone, a hint of amber that will grow stronger as the day wears on. The warp threads, caught in this light, seem to have absorbed some of its warmth, their natural ecru color deepening to a richer shade, like cream that has been gently heated over a low flame. The weaver feels the warmth from the back of his neck and on his forearms, and he works with a slightly looser rhythm than before, his body relaxed and at ease in the comfortable heat. The shuttle, after so many hours of continuous use, has taken on an almost living quality in the weaver's hands, its weight and balance so familiar that it seems like an extension of his own arm. The The boxwood has a subtle grain that his fingers know by touch, a faint pattern of darker and lighter lines that runs the length of the shuttle and gives it a quiet beauty, the kind of beauty that comes from natural materials and careful craftsmanship. The weaver does not think about this beauty in so many words, but he feels it, a small, wordless appreciation that is there each time he picks up the shuttle and sends it on its journey. The shuttle has been with him for many years, a faithful companion that has thrown countless miles of weft thread across countless warps, and it shows no sign of wearing out. The wood still hard and smooth, the metal guide still bright, the bobbin still spinning freely on its tiny axle. The sounds of the loom are subtly different in the afternoon than they were in the morning, a change brought about by the warmth and the slight expansion of the wooden parts. The treadles creak a little more softly now, the fibers of the wood having absorbed some moisture from the air and become more pliable, and the beater swings with a slightly fuller sound, a deeper thud that resonates through the floorboards and can be felt, very faintly, in the soles of the weaver's feet. The heddles, too, have a different tone, their rustling whisper a shade quieter, as if the warmth has muffled them with a thin blanket of silence. The weaver notices these changes without remarking on them, his ears attuned to the loom's voice in all its subtle variations, and he adjusts his rhythm accordingly, pressing the treadles with a slightly lighter touch, letting the beaters swing with a fraction less force to compensate for the fuller sound. His breathing has synchronized with the loom so completely now that the boundary between the two seems to have dissolved, the inhale and exhale matching the swing of the beater and the flight of the shuttle in a seamless, unconscious dance. Each breath is slow and deep, filling his lungs with the warm, silk-scented air and then releasing it in a steady, controlled stream that does not disturb the fine fibers floating in the sunbeam. The weaver's heart beats in its own steady rhythm, a slower pulse that underlies the quicker tempo of the weaving, and the two rhythms interlace like warp and weft, a biological cloth being woven inside his chest to match the silk cloth growing on the loom. The woven fabric on the breastbeam now measures a good length, perhaps 2 feet of finished cloth that has accumulated since the morning, and the weaver pauses occasionally to brush his palm over its surface, checking the evenness and the tension. The silk is cool to the touch despite the warmth of the room, its dense structure insulating it from the ambient heat, and it feels substantial and alive under his hand, a thing of weight and presence that did not exist a few hours ago. The selvages are straight and firm, the body of the cloth is smooth and free of flaws, and the colour, that warm natural ecru, seems to glow softly in the amber light, promising the beauty that will emerge fully when the cloth is taken from the loom and finished. The weaver is pleased, though his pleasure is a quiet, inward thing that does not show on his face, only in the slight relaxation of his shoulders and the steadiness of his hands. Outside, the street has fallen into its deepest afternoon quiet, a lull that will last until the shops reopen and the carts begin to roll again towards the market. The only sound that rises to the attic is the distant, rhythmic tap of a walking stick on the pavement, a slow, measured pace that suggests an elderly gentleman taking his constitutional, in no hurry to get anywhere. The tap fades into the distance, and then there is only the low, constant hum of the city, a sound so pervasive that it is more like a texture than a noise, a background presence that the weaver has not consciously heard in years. The birds have fallen silent in the heat, saving their energy for the cooler hours of the evening, and even the ever-present sparrows have retreated to the shadows under the eaves, their small bodies still and quiet. The weaver, his mind still adrift on the gentle tide of the work, begins to feel the first faint stirrings of the day's accumulated fatigue, not a sharp tiredness, but a soft, pleasant heaviness that sits in his limbs and behind his eyes. This is the tiredness of good, honest work, the kind that comes from steady effort rather than strain, and it does not interfere with his weaving or slow his pace. It simply adds another layer to the quiet contentment of the afternoon, a deepening of the calm that has been growing since the first shuttle throw of the morning. He does not fight the tiredness or try to push it away. He lets it be there, a companionable presence that will see him through to the end of the day's work and then release him into the rest of the evening. The shadows in the attic have begun to lengthen, stretching across the floorboards from the legs of the loom and the stool and the little table, their edges slightly softer than the sharp shadows of noon. The light has taken on a creamier quality, a softening that is the first hint of the approaching evening, though the sun is still high enough that the change is almost imperceptible. The dust motes, still dancing in the beam, catch this softer light and seem to glow with a warmer, more golden tone. Their endless, slow spirals a visual echo of the shuttle's patient flight. The weaver's shadow, cast on the whitewashed wall behind him, moves in a rhythmic, swaying motion that follows the swing of the beater, a dark, silent partner that mimics his every gesture without effort or will. And so the afternoon passes, measured not in minutes or hours, but in inches of silk, in the steady accumulation of weft threads that build the cloth thread by thread, pass by pass. The shuttle song continues, low and steady and unchanging, a lullaby that fills the attic and spills out through the dormer window into the quiet street, too soft to be heard by anyone passing by, but present nonetheless. A tiny, peaceful sound in the heart of the great, noisy city. The weaver weaves on, his hands sure, his mind at rest, the afternoon slowly deepening into evening around him. The light thickens as the afternoon wears on, the amber tones deepening into a richer, warmer glow that seems to fill the attic, like honey poured slowly into a jar. The sun has dropped low enough now that its rays slant almost horizontally through the dormer window, and they strike the opposite wall in a long golden rectangle that inches downward as the minutes pass. The weaver, still at his bench, still throwing the shuttle with the same steady rhythm, sees this change in the light without lifting his eyes from the fell of the cloth, his peripheral vision registering the slow shift of brightness and shadow that marks the approach of evening. The warp threads, which glowed pale silver in the morning and warm cream at noon, have now taken on a deeper, richer color, a soft golden hue that makes them look less like silk and more like spun light itself. Each time the shed opens and the shuttle passes through, the weft thread catches this golden light and flashes for an instant before being covered by the closing of the warp, a tiny recurrent spark that punctuates the rhythm like a visual heartbeat. The dust motes, still drifting in their endless dance, have become points of pure gold, suspended in the thick amber air, and they move so slowly now that they seem almost stationary, as if the light itself had grown too heavy for them to carry. The weaver pauses in his work and reaches for the oil lamp that hangs from a hook on the ceiling beam, a simple brass vessel with a glass chimney and a small wick that he trims each morning before the work begins. The lamp is not yet lit, but the evening is drawing close enough that he wants it ready, the matchbox placed nearby, the wick adjusted to the right height. He lifts the glass chimney carefully, the glass cool and smooth under his fingers, and he checks the level of the oil in the reservoir, finding it sufficient for the remainder of the day's work. The oil is a clear, pale liquid with a faint, sharp scent, a smell that will become stronger when the lamp is lit and the flame begins to consume it, and the weaver knows this scent as intimately as he knows the smell of the silk and the size and the linseed oil, another thread in the rich olfactory tapestry of the attic. He sets the chimney back in place and positions the lamp so that it hangs directly over the breastbeam, where its light, when it is lit, will fall on the fell of the cloth and illuminate the exact point where the shuttle passes through the shed. This positioning is a matter of careful habit, adjusted over many evenings until the lamp hangs at precisely the right height and angle, its circle of light overlapping with the rectangle of fading daylight from the window to create a zone of clear, warm illumination that makes the work of the evening hours comfortable and sure. The weaver gives the lamp a gentle push with his finger, and it swings once, twice, in a small, slow arc, the brass fittings glinting in the golden light, and then it settles back into stillness, ready for the moment when it will be called into service. He returns to the bench and resumes his weaving, the shuttle flying back and forth, the beater swinging, the cloth growing. The rhythm has not changed, but the weaver is aware, in the quiet way that he is aware of all the subtle shifts in his working environment, that the day is winding down, that the hours of good, natural light are almost spent. He does not feel any urgency about this. The lamp will provide all the light he needs, and the work will continue at its own pace until the appointed hour when he sets the shuttle down for the last time and covers the loom for the night. The approaching darkness is not an enemy, but a companion, a gentle presence that will wrap the attic in its soft blue embrace and signal the transition from work to rest. Through the window, the sky has begun its slow transformation from pale blue to the first faint wash of rose and lavender, the colors so delicate that they seem painted onto the air with a brush of the finest sable. A few high clouds, the same clouds that the weaver watched during his midday pause, have drifted further to the east and now catch the sunset colors on their undersides, turning pink and gold and soft peach against the deepening blue. The roofs of the houses opposite, the church spire in the distance, and the bare branches of a plane tree that rises from a hidden courtyard all stand in dark silhouette against this glowing sky, their edges sharp and clear in the crystalline evening light. The weaver, glancing up from his work for a moment, takes in this quiet beauty with a calm, appreciative eye, and then returns his attention to the loom, the image of the sunset sky lingering in his mind like the afterglow of a peaceful thought. Now the light fades further, the golden rectangle on the wall dimming to a soft, dusky grey, and the shadows in the corners of the attic deepen from soft grey to a velvety black that seems to absorb the remaining light and hold it close. The weaver reaches up and takes the matchbox from the shelf, a small tin box with a striking surface on the side, and he removes a single match, a thin splinter of wood with a red head that smells faintly of sulphur. He strikes the match against the side of the box with a quick, practiced motion, and the head bursts into a small, crackling flame that throws a warm orange light across his face and hands. He holds the flame to the wick of the lamp, and the wick catches, a tiny blue flame appearing at its tip, and then settling into a steady yellow glow as he adjusts the height with the brass knob. He replaces the glass chimney, and the flame steadies behind it, casting a soft, even circle of light that falls directly on the breast beam and the fell of the cloth, the rest of the attic retreating into a comfortable, shadowy dimness. The lamplight changes everything in its small circle of influence, transforming the cool, golden glow of the sunset into a warmer, more intimate illumination that seems to draw the world in close around the loom. The warp threads caught in the lamplight become a sheet of molten gold, each individual filament gleaming with a soft, liquid fire that shifts and ripples as the heddles rise and fall. The shuttle, as it flies through the shed, seems to glow from within, its honey-coloured boxwood reflecting the flame in a warm, diffuse radiance, and the weft thread, as it pays out behind it, catches the light and shines for an instant, like a fine golden wire, before being woven into the cloth. The weaver's hands, too, are illuminated by the lamp, their weathered skin and short, clean nails appearing in sharp, warm detail against the darker background of the room. The shadows that the lamp casts are different from the shadows of daylight, softer at the edges, but darker at their centers, and they move in a slow, rhythmic dance on the walls and the ceiling as the weaver works. The loom's uprights throw long, dark bars that stretch across the whitewashed plaster and waver slightly with each swing of the beater, bars that bend and shift as the lamp sways almost imperceptibly on its hook. The weaver's own shadow looms large behind him, a dark, silent giant that mimics his every movement with perfect fidelity, its arms swinging in time with his arms, its head nodding slightly with the rhythm of the work. The whole attic seems alive with these gentle, dancing shadows, a soft, visual music that accompanies the low, steady sounds of the loom. The sounds of the evening are different too, or perhaps it is only that the weaver notices them more now that the daylight has faded and the world outside has grown quieter. The distant rumble of the last cart heading home, the faint bark of a dog in a far-off courtyard, the soft cooing of a pigeon settling on the roof ridge above the attic. All these sounds seem clearer and more distinct in the evening, quiet as if the darkness had sharpened the weaver's hearing. The loom's own sounds, the treadle thump and the heddle whisper and the shuttle knock and the beater thud, seem louder too, or at least more present, filling the small lamplit space with their steady, hypnotic pulse. The weaver listens without listening, his ears receiving the sounds and letting them pass through, a gentle, auditory stream that flows around him and carries him along. The warmth of the lamp combines with the residual warmth of the day to create a snug, comfortable heat in the attic, a heat that is concentrated in the small circle of light around the loom and fades into a pleasant coolness at the edges of the room. The weaver feels this warmth on his face and hands, and it adds to the drowsy, contented feeling that has been growing in him since the afternoon, a feeling of being exactly where he belongs, doing exactly what he should be doing, in a world that is, for this moment at least, perfectly balanced and at peace. The silk continues to grow. Thread by thread, the shuttle continues to fly, and the lamplight continues to burn. A small, steady star in the dark attic, holding back the night for just a little longer. The weaver works on into the evening, the lamplight his sole companion now, its steady yellow flame the only bright point in the dark attic. Outside the window, the sky has deepened from lavender to a soft, deep indigo, and the first faint stars have begun to appear. Tiny points of cold silver light that flicker almost imperceptibly in the still air. The street below is quiet, the last cart having rumbled home long ago, the last pedestrian having turned the corner and disappeared into the warm glow of a lighted doorway. The city is settling into its night rhythm, a slower, softer pulse that will continue until the dawn, and the weaver feels this settling as a corresponding slowing in his own body, a gradual winding down that tells him the day's work is nearly done. He has been weaving by lamplight for perhaps an hour now, the shuttle continuing its steady flight, the beater continuing its gentle swing, but the rhythm has begun to slow, not from weariness, but from a sense of completion, a feeling that the day has given all it needs to give, and that what remains is only the quiet, deliberate act of bringing things to a close. The cloth on the breastbeam has grown to a length of nearly 3 feet since the morning, a full day's work that is neither rushed nor meagre, and the weaver runs his palm over its surface one final time, feeling the even, cool smoothness that speaks of a job properly done. The silk glows warmly in the lamplight, its natural ecru color deepened to a rich, creamy gold, and the selvages are as straight and true as the lines of a ruled page. Now the weaver makes the final pass of the shuttle, the last thin line of weft sent sailing across the shed and beaten home with a soft, definitive thud. He holds the beater for a moment at the fell, feeling the slight resistance of the pack threads, and then he lets it swing back to its resting position, the reed coming to a stop with a faint musical rattle. The shuttle he places gently in its wooden box, where it sits with the quiet finality of a tool that has done its duty. The loom falls silent, the treadles still, the heddles motionless, the warp threads stretched in their patient, waiting state, and the sudden absence of sound fills the attic like the ringing of a great, silent bell. The weaver sits for a moment on the bench, his hands resting on his thighs, his breathing slowing, his eyes gazing at the woven cloth that represents the sum of his day's labor. He's tired in the good, honest way that comes from steady work, a tiredness that sits lightly in his muscles and behind his eyes, a tiredness that will dissolve into the deep, restful sleep that awaits him. The attic, now that the loom is still, seems larger and quieter than before, the shadows cast by the lamp stretching out into the corners and holding the room in a soft, dark embrace. The dust motes have settled, the silk fibers have stopped their drifting, and even the small spider in the window frame has retreated into its crack, its day's work done as well. After a time, the weaver rises from the bench and takes up the small snips from his waistcoat pocket, the same snips he used earlier to cut the damaged warp thread, their blades glinting in the lamplight. He leans over the breastbeam and carefully cuts the weft thread where it emerges from the last pass, leaving a short end that he tucks neatly into the self-gedge with the tip of his finger. Then he examines the newly woven cloth one more time, bending close to the surface and letting the lamplight fall across it at a low angle, revealing the perfect regularity of the weave, the absence of any skipped threads or thin spots or other flaws. The cloth is good as any he has ever woven, and he straightens up with a quiet, inward satisfaction that does not need to be spoken aloud. The loom must now be tidied and prepared for the night, a small ritual that the weaver performs each evening with the same careful, methodical attention that he gives to the weaving itself. He begins by brushing the shuttle race with a soft cloth, removing the fine pale dust of size that has accumulated over the course of the day, the dust rising in a tiny cloud and then settling onto the floorboards. He wipes the reed with the same cloth, running it gently along the metal teeth to dislodge any trapped fibers, and he brushes the heddles too, where a faint fuzz of silk has gathered around the polished eyes. Each of these small acts of cleaning is performed without haste, a slow, respectful putting to bed of the great wooden frame that has served him so faithfully. Next he turns the small handle at the side of the loom to advance the warp slightly, pulling a fresh section of warp threads into the working area and winding the newly woven cloth onto the cloth beam. out of sight under the breastbeam. The ratchet clicks softly in the quiet attic, and the weaver counts the clicks under his breath, stopping when exactly the right number have passed. Then he moves to the back of the loom and adjusts the tension on the warp beam, easing it slightly so that the threads are not held at full stretch through the night, a precaution against the damp air that might cause them to contract and snap. The warp threads sigh as the tension releases, a soft, almost inaudible sound that speaks of rest and relief. The weaver takes up a length of clean, unbleached linen from a hook on the wall, a cloth that is kept for this sole purpose, and he drapes it carefully over the warp, covering the threads from the heddles back to the warp beam. This cover will protect the silk from the night dust and from any moths that might find their way into the attic, and it will also prevent the morning sun from fading the threads before they can be woven. The linen falls in soft white folds over the loom, giving the great frame a ghostly, shrouded appearance in the dim light, and the weaver smooths it with his hands, making sure that it hangs straight and covers everything. Now only the lamp remains to be tended. The weaver reaches up and turns the small brass knob that controls the wick, lowering the flame until it is just a tiny blue point that barely casts any light at all. And then, with a soft puff of breath, he blows it out entirely. The attic plunges into darkness, a deep, velvety black that is absolute for a moment. And then the faint grey square of the dormer window begins to assert itself. The starlight and the distant glow of the city sky seeping through the small panes and casting a dim, silvery light that is just enough to see by. The weaver stands still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, and the familiar shapes of the attic gradually emerge from the darkness. The loom, a dark, quiet mass in the center of the floor. The stool, a smaller shadow beside it. The roof beams angling up into the invisible ceiling. The weaver walks to the window and closes the shutters, the wooden panels meeting with a soft, firm sound that seals the attic off from the outside world. Then he turns and, with his bare feet finding the familiar path across the floorboards without the need for sight, he moves towards the narrow staircase that leads down into the main house. He pauses at the top of the stairs and looks back once at the loom, a dark, shrouded shape that waits in patient silence for the morning, and he gives a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of farewell and of gratitude that no one sees. Then he descends the stairs, each step creaking softly under his weight, a familiar, reassuring sound that accompanies him down into the warmer, darker rooms below. The attic settles into its night silence, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, a silence made of old wood and still air and the memory of the day's steady, patient work. The loom stands under its linen cover, the warp threads resting at ease, the shuttle in its box, the reed clean and ready. The scent of linseed oil and beeswax and raw silk lingers in the air, a quiet perfume that will greet the weaver when he climbs the stairs again in the morning. The small spider in the window frame sleeps in its crack, and a single late moth flutters against the outside of the glass, drawn by the faint glow of the city beyond, then drifts away into the night. The street below is silent, the house is dark, the church spire a black silhouette against the starry sky, and the whole of Spitalfields lies at rest, its weavers asleep, its loom still, waiting for the first grey light of dawn to begin the slow, peaceful rhythm all over again